everybody, I'm Patrick. Welcome to the workshop. Today I am fixing a shelf I made years ago for a client that just got back in touch and said it needed some repairs. This shelf is a little box shelf that hangs on the wall with no visible fixings. Now, I have done a video previously about how I hang a shelf using French cleats. This is a different method of hanging a shelf or a little box shelf with no visible fixings. And I'll be using this little keyhole bit, which is a router bit, which is used to cut a keyhole type hole that you can then place a screw in to hold it onto the wall. This is the shelf here. It's an odd little unit. It actually sits on the wall in this orientation with this member coming out and floating. And this side here will be mounted onto the wall. Now, it previously had some keyholes in there, but they'd pulled out really badly. They took it off the wall when a painter came and did some work in the house, and then they'd kind of just wrecked the holes. So I filled the holes with the domino and some epoxy, and I'm going to be rerouting these holes and showing you how to do it. The actual cutting of this little keyhole is not particularly difficult. You could essentially just plunge this down and move it across and then pull it back out again. For consistency, I'm going to drill the entry hole using a 1/2 inch brad point bit, and then I'm going to place the router bit in there and move it across. That's simple. In order for this shelf to hang on the wall and be strong, or even to go onto the screws, it needs to be really accurate. We do not have a lot of leeway. We do not have a lot of flexibility. It needs to be more exact than using a French cleat. In essence, a French cleat you just put onto the wall and drop down, and there should be a little bit of wiggle left to right. With this system, you need 4 screws to be in exactly the right position. The shelf slides onto those screws and then slides over by about 1 centimeter or 1.5 centimeters. By creating a template that we use to cut the holes in the shelf and the holes in the wall, we will reduce the likelihood of error. I've cut this piece of MDF. It is exactly the size of this shelf. I've marked the location of the old holes because I don't really want to be in that same place. I don't mind entering in there, but I don't want the meat of the keyhole to be on that area. It just won't be as strong. And then we can use this template to mark the exact holes on the wall as well. So I've marked the location that I want these holes to be through the template. I'm just going to punch those locations with a punch so that when I place my drill bit on these marks, the drill bit goes exactly where I want it to go and it doesn't wander. When you're making this jig, you need to consider what fixing you're going to use into the wall. So you need to know what the wall is and how hard that's going to be for you. This is a masonry wall from memory. I'll double check that. I'll be using green wall plugs, which are 7 millimeters in diameter. And then I'll use I was going to use a pan head screw, but I actually don't have enough length in that. So I'm using this longer countersunk screw. This is a 10 gauge screw. What that means is that I need a 7 millimeter hole in this jig, so I can actually use this template to hold my masonry drill bit in exactly the right position, because my masonry drill bit will also be 7 millimeters. So I'm going to drill 7 mil holes in the template. I'm then going to use a brad point bit to mark the center point into my actual shelf. Now that we have the locations marked on our shelf, we can drill our initial hole, which is going to be with a 12.7 mil drill bit, 1/2 inch, and we're going to go about 12 mil deep. We're going 12 mil deep because that's the height that this router bit can cut to leave the most amount of meat for our screw to grab in the keyhole. I'll be doing this by eye, which is not my favorite, as in I won't be doing this process on a drill press. I probably could, but it's only going in 12 mil deep, and I'm confident I can get this straight enough for this application. Now that we have our initial holes where they need to be, we can now use the router bit to create the slot, the T-shaped slot, which will allow this piece to grab onto the screws on the wall. I want the length of these slots to all be the same. It's not super critical, but the shelf can only move along as far as the shortest slot, so they might as well all be the same. So I'm just going to mark the distance from the edge of my hole, my 12mm half-inch hole, and I'm going to move the slot across about 15mm. So I'll mark that out on everything. Once you've drilled the holes and you're ready to cut the slots with the router bit, make sure you've got the fence on in the right position so that the router bit is falling exactly into that hole that you've drilled and that the depth is correct for the slot as well. I get the router bit up to full speed and then gently plunge it into that hole. It's not really doing any cutting because the hole's already there, but if you try and start in the hole, chances are it's just either not going to start or it's going to rattle around in that hole because the tolerance is just too tight. If you're able to cut your hole with your drill bit much bigger than the router bit, you could start the router bit in the hole. But in this instance, I've got essentially a half-inch router bit and a half-inch hole with my drill bit, so I can't really start in there. So I start the router bit, plunge it down into that hole, move it across to 15mm, and then back across and out. That's it. So now I have the keyhole slots, all 4 of them, done on this shelf. And I know the exact locations that the screws need to be in the wall. Now, in a perfect world, if you were building a box shelf, these keyholes would be oriented vertically so that you can push the shelf on and it drops down and is secure. This is an unusual shelf because it doesn't really have 2 verticals. It's really only got 1 that's touching the wall. And so this shelf is going to go on and slide across. Obviously, there is some risk of it coming off if the shelf gets moved back to that original position, but the client's aware of this. These keyholes are only as strong as the timber. There's essentially about 8mm of timber meat there that the head of the screw is hooking onto. So I wouldn't be using a keyhole hanging system for something like a bookshelf that was going to hold a lot of weight. This shelf really needs to hold its own weight plus a couple of ornaments. Now, the advantage is it is perfectly invisible on the wall and you can create a piece of furniture with 0 backing and 0 kind of bracing strips or French cleats or anything else that's visible. It looks fantastic, but again, it's more for potentially ornamental pieces than something that needs to hold a lot of weight. I'm going to go through the installation process. I'm going to do it on this piece of chipboard in my workshop because I don't want to film this in the client's house. And this is easier. I can just screw into the chipboard and show you the process. When you have a piece that you want to install on the wall, it's really important that you mark level. And I usually do this with some tape and a level. If you've got a laser, use a laser, but you know, most of you don't. I know this is the shape of my shelf because this is the template. So I'm just going to hold that roughly up on the wall so I can visualize where it's going to go. If you had an exact height you needed it to be, then you could measure from the floor to that height. Okay, so I've decided I want the top of this shelf to be 500mm from the floor in this scenario, which is not representative. Okay, that's about there at that little mark. I'm going to lay some masking tape down and then I can mark actual level on that masking tape so I'm not marking all over my wall. I'm going to mark my 500mm initial starting point and then I'm going to mark level off that. Now that line could represent the very top of the shelf, in which case your screws are going to be 9mm lower than that in this situation. Or that line could represent the actual line of the screws, in which case the top of your shelf is going to be 9mm higher than that line. You just need to take that into account. I've got this jig in the orientation that the shelf goes, because that matters. And I've got those little holes there that I can use to mark the locations of my screws. I'm going to need to put a line of masking tape at the lower point of the lower screws as well, so that I can mark all of them without marking on the wall. It's really hard often to hold the jig in location and mark the screw holes. If you've got someone to help you, that's great. If you don't, you can use double-sided tape or even just masking tape to hold the thing in the right spot. Even if you can't put the tape over the top of the wall like I can, usually good quality masking tape will have enough strength to hold even just on a flat wall. With the jig in position, I can mark those holes. Now this jig was designed to use a 7mm masonry bit. I'm just drilling these screws into chipboard, so I'm not going to use the jig as a drill holder. I've just used it to mark the locations. I'll find the center of those locations and then drill a pilot hole for my screws. You need to keep in mind with keyhole mounting that the location that you drill the holes or that you insert the screws is either 15mm to the left or the right of where the final position will be, or up and down, depending on where you have placed these keyholes in your piece of furniture. So if you have an exact location for a shelf, you need to take in that the shelf goes in and then moves across to its final position. Now I can place my screws in the holes, but we don't drive them all the way to the wall. They need to stick out by the depth of the keyhole, essentially. So I can test that now. So I marked on that with a texter, permanent marker, and I know that I need to go until I can still just see that little red mark on the screw. Once all the screws are installed and you go to fit this, we can tighten them up little by little until we can feel that the unit is grabbing onto the wall, that it's a nice tight fit. I wouldn't remove the tape until you've done a test fit of the shelf, just in case you need to move the screws, which would be unfortunate. If it's really stiff to get on and off, it either means that your locations aren't great, or potentially you have screwed your screws in too tight. This was firm, but it actually went on pretty smoothly. There is a slight gap along the top here, which means I can tighten up at least one or two of the screws. That process is a matter of taking the shelf off, tightening it up a fraction, put it back on, sometimes a number of times to get just the right balance of tension versus too hard. Once you know it fits, you can take the tape off and there will be no visible fixings at all, which for a really minimal shelf like this is kind of wonderful. Ta-da! Perfect. It's been a while since I've posted an image of one of these shelves on social media. I don't really make them that much anymore, but whenever I did post them, I always got asked how they were attached to the wall. That keyhole bit is how I did it. Now, they come in different sizes. This one used the keyhole bit that has a 1/2 inch head, 12.7mm. There is also a much smaller one, which you can use for smaller screws or smaller pieces where the wall thickness is not as thick. Either one works well. The process is the same. I find it easiest to drill the pilot hole first with a drill bit and then create some sort of simple jig to slide that router bit along. The really key thing to get this right is to create the template. If you were making this as a product over and over, you'd use the same template every time. You could even ship a paper template with the piece. This is just, a one-off to help this old customer get this back on their wall. So I'll take the template to their house, install the screws in the brick wall, and then reinstall the shelf. I hope you got something out of it. It's a really simple router bit. There'll be a link down below to where you can buy it. It's a great technique for installing shelves in an elegant way that can't really be seen. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week with some more stuff that I'm making in my workshop.